Great, wonderful. Everybody's here. Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, once again, I'm Burçin Ünel. I am at the Institute for Policy Integrity at New York University School of Law, and I have the privilege of moderating this panel. This panel is going to talk about research threads from different disciplines that are relevant to Justice40 and Equitable Deep Decarbonization. We're going to talk about some research areas and key issues that we need to consider when conducting relevant energy justice relevant research. Before I introduce our panelists, a few housekeeping items. Please use the Q&A function throughout the panel to ask questions, comments, or respond to other questions and comments. We will be having a Q&A at the end of the session, and we will be asking questions from your questions. Our panelists are going to talk about 10 minutes, summarizing insights from their own fields, and then we're going to have Q&A. And don't forget, we are circulating a Google form, so you can send us your research that are relevant to the topics we're discussing and Justice40 implementation. All right, so I'm very excited to introduce our panelists. First, Baptista. Dr. Baptista is an assistant professor of professional practice in the Environmental Policy and Sustainability Management graduate program at the Mellon School of Policy, Management and Environment. She also serves as the co-director of the Tishman Environment and Design Center at the New School. Her research and professional practice focuses on environmental and climate justice. She works directly with EJ organizations and coalitions to support advancement of environmental justice. Then we're going to hear from Joan Catie. Dr. Catie is an assistant professor of environmental health sciences at the Mellon School of Public Health at Columbia University. Dr. Catie is an environmental epidemiologist who focuses on environmental health, environmental justice, and sustainability. Her research uses electronic records and spatial statistics to study the relationship between emerging environmental exposures and population health. She also considers vulnerable populations and the implications of health disparities, particularly in the era of climate change. Then we have Catie Hausman. Dr. Hausman is an associate professor at the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy and the research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Her work focuses on environmental and energy economics. Her recent projects looked at inequality and environmental quality, the natural gas sector's role in methane leaks, the impact of climate change on the electricity grid, and the effects of nuclear power plant closures. And last but not least, we have Destenie Nock. Dr. Nock is an assistant professor of engineering and public policy and civil and environmental engineering. She builds models that analyze how changes in the power plants used to supply energy would impact the job creation, environmental health, and economic viability of various communities. She also performed energy systems modeling and analysis in both New England and sub-Saharan Africa using multi-criteria decision-making analysis and applied optimization to better equip policymakers to understand energy planning options. So with that, I want to turn the microphone to Anna.
Hi, everyone. I have a little PowerPoint with some slides, but having some trouble sharing. So I actually asked Burçin if she could, I don't know if you can share my slides from where you are.
I could do it if you can give me access.
Okay, great. I'm going to do that here. Just going to try giving you access here. 1 second. Sorry, everyone. Technical fun here.
Maybe you can email me the slides, and in the meantime, Joan can.
Yeah, that would be great, actually, if John wants to go first. Yeah,
great. Let's do that.
Maybe I'll have more success. We'll see. All right. Does that look reasonable? Okay, cool. Okay, so, well, thank you so much for the invitation to speak with you all today. Excited to kind of talk through some of the things I've been working on and others. So I will just get into it here. And there's Manhattan, where I live during that huge northeastern blackout. All right. Okay, so I just wanted to start with, we all probably are familiar with this, but I think seeing it over time is helpful, and kind of how we've been generating electricity in the United States over time. And so this obviously differs state to state, but we used to be big into coal. That has gone down a huge amount over the last couple of decades, primarily replaced with domestic natural gas. So a lot from fracking, which is another area that I do research in, but I won't talk about today. And you can see we're starting to see, right, this like small uptick in some of our renewable sources, with wind by 2019 making up 7%. And so what does this look like nationwide? The center of the country is still heavily reliant on coal as their main fuel source for electricity generation. We're seeing shifts in many other parts of the country, especially places with shale plays, towards natural gas. And we actually have a couple states, including Iowa, where wind was actually the primary source. So this shift is happening. But as it's shifting, some other things are happening. As we know, our electric grid is aging. With climate change, we're seeing less reliability. We're having more weather events that are leading to longer power disruptions for folks in the United States. And so 2020 was the longest recorded amount of power interruptions at 8 hours on average nationwide. And so the EIA provides this type of information. You can see with major events, meaning related to an extreme weather event like a hurricane, the winter storm in Texas, those sorts of things. So we've been working on, though, getting to a finer geographic resolution to really kind of understand this, because EIA is generally reporting about power outages summarized nationwide, which when we're thinking about intervention and changes to the grid and where we need to reinforce things, not that helpful. So what we've been doing is using data from Power Outage US, which pulls from utility APIs information every 10 minutes on the number of customers without power. And so using this data from 2018 to 2020, we've been starting to look at power outages at the county level nationwide. And so here I'm presenting annual averages, but we can do this at much finer temporal resolutions too. And so you can start to get the picture of places in the United States. This is looking at the number of 8+ hour outages at the county level. And so you can see places that are having trouble: Michigan, not doing well, much of Appalachia, many parts of Maine, and a lot of Northern California and Louisiana. So we have some spots of the country that really are experiencing many more power outages than other places. And so I mentioned we have this data every 10 minutes. So we can also start to look on average each month over the year. And then also on the y-axis, this is across the day in military time. And so we can see the red color represents more 8-hour outages. And so what we're seeing is more outages, which, kind of corroborates what people anecdotally say. But during, from April through August, when we have a lot of demands to run air conditioning, and there may be additional weather events going on here. And then we're also seeing the time of day that these power outages tend to start, which again, makes sense from what folks have said, but where we can actually look at these patterns nationwide, and we're seeing more taking place, when people are getting home from work, 5, 6 p.m. And the thing that we've also noted is this social disparity, where here we're using the Center for Disease Control and Prevention Social Vulnerability Index. We're just looking at quartiles. So the first quartile are those counties in the US that are the least vulnerable on this metric. And the fourth quartile are the most vulnerable counties. We can kind of see, unfortunately, this stepwise increase in where we're seeing more outages occurring at the county level nationwide. So with that, I would say clean and renewable energy makes sense. I'm going to argue this is true for 5 reasons. That by installing and using more renewable, we can slow climate change, We can reduce unequitable environmental exposures from fossil fuel generating sources. We can improve population health, improve energy and energy security, and enhance our resilience to extreme weather events. So just a few thoughts on these five points, which many of us have thought about. I'm not unique here. But of course, by installing and using more renewable, we can slow climate change. 11% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from methane. A third of that alone comes from our oil and gas systems. And we know that methane is much more potent, over a 20-year period, 80 times more potent than CO2. And so tamping down on methane emissions right now can have short-term impacts and start helping us make these climate goals. Second, we can hope to reduce inequitable exposures that we know exist around fossil fuel production and generation. So this is some work led by David Gonzalez, who's a postdoc out at Berkeley. And here we're looking at historic redlining as it relates to the location of oil and gas wells in the United States. And so this is an example of a neighborhood in Los Angeles where grade D, or these communities that were redlined in the 1930s and unable to receive mortgages, which has had cascading effects on wealth accumulation and other factors in the United States. But we find this kind of stepwise increase across grades where grade D or redline communities in the United States, and these are in urban areas in the United States, had much higher counts of wells. And you see this stepwise increase from those that received grade A, having very few wells ever drilled in those communities. So evidence of this going on in the past, and if we stop drilling, these exposures would eventually go away. We've also thought about the way to enhance equity as we're turning some of these fossil fuel plants off. So this is work with Elena Krieger and Seth Shonkoff at PSE Healthy Energy. This is around peaker power plants, which are those plants that turn on in times of high demand and are quite polluting when they do turn on. And so this was a case study in California where we linked CalEnviroScreen to the location of the peaker power plants in California. And we came up with some calculations around the CalEnviroScreen score, where each of the plants were located, and also how many days at that plant when they were generating exceeded air quality standards. And so this is to help kind of target both equity and air pollution in order to sequentially turn off these plants as we transition to renewables. And so these plants located up in this top right quadrant would be those that are very inequitably located and also are very polluting. And so you might prioritize these plants to shut down first. We can also improve population health. As we transition to renewables, there's a lot of literature on the links between coal-fired power plant emissions and adverse health outcomes. There's a lot of research recently on oil and gas development and adverse birth outcomes and other factors. Just wanted to highlight the study that we did in Louisville, Kentucky, where we actually got to have some good news, where coal-fired power plants located nearby turned off. We were able to characterize that reduction in emissions being linked to lower exposures in the city of Louisville. And we were then also able to link those plants turning off to reduced asthma visits at the emergency department and hospitalizations across the city. And so these types of studies can also help bolster the economic and health arguments around this switch. We can also hopefully increase energy security. I think the current Ukrainian-Russian war is a good example. We know we have different countries worldwide that gain much of their power and influence from fossil fuel production. And so if others were able to produce more energy domestically, presumably renewable energy, we would have more power in the decision-making process. And lastly, we could enhance our resilience to extreme weather events. So I really like this paper. I wasn't involved in it, but I like to talk about it because I think it's really interesting. And so this group took Detroit and Phoenix, and they simulated what indoor temperatures would be if the power is on. And that's what you're looking at here during a heat wave. So this is a 5-day heat wave that matched actual temperatures that occurred in Detroit and Phoenix between 1980 and 2009. And so you can see yellow isn't great. There's exposure. The exposure risk here is fatigue, up to orange, maroon, et cetera. So you can see Detroit, even when the power is on, there are some people at at risk of fatigue, and you can see throughout dotted homes that are extreme caution or danger levels of exposure. Phoenix is looking pretty good when the power's on because there's really a lot of air conditioning going on in Phoenix, but they also simulate if there's a 5-day power outage that co-occurs with this heat wave. And now things are looking really bad. So we can see in Detroit, almost everywhere is at the extreme caution or higher level. And in Phoenix, almost everyone is likely to get heat exhaustion, and heat stroke is possible for many. And so this illustrates something that may not, would not happen if we had distributed solar that could keep generating. We're not all linked into the same grid where there could be a massive outage that spans, for example, the entire city or the entire state of Texas, as we saw in the spring of 2021. This is some work by a doctoral student here at Columbia, again, using those power outage US data. And here we're just looking at how many people were without power and what the spatial distribution of what that was across the state of Texas. We also have some EJ work going on within this, but I won't get into that today. But what I did want to point out is what the sources of electricity production looked like during this event in Texas. And we saw these sweeping outages when non-weatherized production facilities dropped dramatically in their ability to produce. So we saw huge deficits in gas, coal, and wind production, but we actually saw this huge uptick in solar. And so nice to have this distribution of different sources feeding into the grid. So that's my argument that clean and renewable energy makes sense for these 5 reasons. And I will say thank you to my collaborators, some really great students here at Columbia, Diana Hernandez, faculty member here who has worked a lot on these issues, Matt King at Stanford, and Jeff Schlegel-Milch, who is at the National Center for Disaster Preparedness here. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Joan, for that presentation. Anna, should we try again, or should I share my screen?
Let's give it a try. Let's see if I can get it. Looks like I can get it on this computer. So
great.
I'm going to try.
Great.
Yeah, looks like I got it, right? Yeah. Looks like you can all see it, right?
Yes.
Success. All right. Well, thank you for the invitation to join this conversation. It's really an interesting conversation. And it's an opportunity to also reflect on the last year and a half, or it feels like much longer, of really digging into Justice40 and what it means for environmental justice communities. I'm at the Tishman Environment and Design Center here at the New School, and much of my work is really focused on co-producing research with groups on the ground, environmental justice organizations, and we adhere to the HAMASH principles and EJ principles and all of the action-based collaborative research we've been doing. And some of the types of research we've co-produced with groups are things like how to define EJ communities and how to map and codify the impacts, cumulative impacts in overburdened areas, and how to advance policies like mandatory emissions reductions in the power sector. We've also done some work on the equity implications of climate mitigation policies like the Clean Power Plan, and the distribution of renewable energy funds in states, and trying to really help communities track emerging false solutions, particularly in the energy sector, that they're very worried will continue to entrench patterns of inequality and racism. So that's some of the work that we have done. And in thinking about the Justice40 work that we've been doing more recently, a lot of what we've been engaged with is learning really from the most generative places to learn from, which is the front lines, the folks who are really in EJ communities at the front lines of the fossil fuel sector and the fence line, and those advocates and communities who have been experiencing the inequalities in the current energy system have a lot to say about how to implement Justice40. And they have, decades of experience around how to try to deliver on the ambition of Justice40 in this particular context that we're in today. And some of the key themes that I've been leaning into as part of these networks are thinking about, really tangible ways to ensure procedural justice and the delivery of Justice 40 and benefits, how to anticipate and overcome a lot of the barriers that are not unique to Justice 40, but cut across lots of different federal and state policy programs. And then really, following the money, really looking at accountability, the distribution and the flow of investments, not talking about benefits broadly now, but investments specifically. So I just wanted to share, I take this opportunity to kind of share some of what I've been learning and folks have been talking about in the movement. And one of the main places I've been doing a lot of this work is through this group called the Equitable and Just National Climate Platform. It's a coalition of groups, both large environmental organizations and environmental justice organizations that came together before the Biden administration to try to develop a climate justice centered platform. And one of the key things that the platform asked for was something akin to the Justice 40 initiative. And so when the Biden administration came in and made this commitment to Justice 40, my center and the Center for American Progress and members of the Equitable and Just National Climate Platform convened a group of environmental justice stakeholders and organizations and environmental justice academics to come together and really try to put forward recommendations to the administration very early on, the first 100 days, to try to set the tone for how you implement Justice 40. And there were some great recommendations that were really crowdsourced from people who were some of the best thinkers and thought leaders in the EJ movement on how to deliver on this promise. And some of the 6 areas that we provided detailed comments on, including the indicators for how to define EJ communities and prioritize investments, processes around the criteria, how to maximize federal investments, and also avoid harms. There was a lot of consideration about how do you avoid the kinds of historic harms we've seen when investments are not well directed, and improving access to existing federal programs and potentially developing new opportunities for federal investments in EJ communities. So there was a whole host of really rich resources there that I wanted to highlight since we spent a lot of time on them. But one of the most gratifying things as part of that process was really developing a set of guidelines that structured a lot of the recommendations around Justice 40, and the environmental justice organizations and the platform felt it was really important to frame all of our thinking and recommendations around Justice 40 around a set of values and principles. What is it that EJ folks think of when they think of benefits? Because benefits is such a vague term, can be easily co-opted. And so we wanted to put really tangible, concrete examples of what is meant by values and benefits in this Justice 40 context. And so the EJ members of the platform developed these examples of what we think of in terms of climate justice and resiliency, just transition, and healthy communities. And many of these things you can see are reflected in the Justice 40 package of covered programs. But many of them also get a little bit more specific about how we get there. So speaking practically about procedural justice in particular, a lot of the recommendations that have been coming out and that did come out early in Justice 40 were how do we ensure meaningful engagement and public dialogue with environmental justice communities to, throughout the process. And, this is not easy. We're talking about a whole of government approach, many federal agencies, regional offices, very complex set of governance structures and jurisdictions. How do we ensure public engagement?
And right now there are, dozens of public virtual meetings from lots of agencies, DOT, DOE, EPA. And you can imagine that all of these agencies are trying to do the right thing. They're trying to open up their agencies and their processes to early and frequent feedback from communities that they serve and constituencies that they serve. But you can imagine that the bandwidth to participate in all of these different processes can be stretched to the limit. And so we really need to think really concretely about how to streamline and amplify tangible opportunities, not only for participation, but for decision-making power and access. And so there's some really good ideas that have been coming out of lots of different places in the movement, things like convening regional hubs and using regional federal agencies, using anchor institutions like HBCUs or community-based centers to host meetings and to put information out about Justice 40, and also capacity building for EJ communities in funding to be able to learn about Justice 40 initiatives and investment priorities. So putting resources into communities early to be able to engage on all these processes. And there's no shortage of great recommendations out there. I just gave a few of these examples. There's some really wonderful reports and resource guides that have been put out, not only for advocates to learn about Justice 40, but also for federal agencies to consider and reflect on in terms of how best to target investments. We have the Emerald Cities Collective put out a Justice 40 playbook. The Luskin Center at UCLA put out a Making Justice 40 a Reality. There are really good resource guides here about how really to target Justice 40. And of course, recently, several EJ organizations also committed their own Bezos Fund funding towards looking at Justice 40 implementation. So these are good places to also refer to and start in terms of thinking about the kinds of procedural justice and also accountability measures that could be put in place for communities.
Anna, if you could wrap in a minute or two, maybe we can come back to some of these questions later during the Q&A.
Sure. I just wanted to mention some of the research we're doing right now in the Equitable and Just National Climate Platform, trying to target a sort of whole of government, whole of investment approach to looking at Justice 40 investments. And so we've been targeting not only the pilot Justice 40, 21 pilot programs in the Justice 40, but looking at each agency and potential covered programs and several different types of investment flows, everything from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act to the appropriations, the most recent appropriations proposals, to identify EJ-centered priority investments that could be put forward by different agencies. And as part of that, we've been looking at also the potential for a tool, in lieu of a scorecard, which hasn't been coming out yet, looking at a tool for layering in these investment priorities into a mapping tool like the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool, so that there's a central repository where advocates and decision makers, policymakers can see all of the potential investments that could be in any geographic area and how it relates to the category of disadvantaged communities. We've also been looking at existing portals for this. There are many existing investment tracker tools that the federal government already has, including the DOE's Justice 40 dashboard, which is very good. And so the question is, can we replicate this or build on this for a whole of government, whole of investment approach for Justice 40? And so our Equitable and Just National Climate Platform has been looking carefully at this sort of agency by agency and covered in the 7 covered programs areas to look at potential investment pools that should be mapped and tracked. So I'm going to end in this slide because I think there's some good ideas, like tangible ideas that federal agencies can consider, including leveraging existing networks where federal agencies and community and EJ groups already come together to think about how to leverage particularly discretionary funding that federal agencies have to target to EG communities and encouraging greater transparency about all the covered programs and investments in a central repository for sharing those investments across advocacy groups and agencies. And we're also doing some work on state level Justice40 task forces to be able to access regional hubs. So yeah, I'll end there and happy to talk more about these issues in the Q&A section.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Anna, for that presentation. Catie?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for having me. I will first caveat that our air conditioner in our office is broken right now, and it is really warm in here, and we have great research that says that heat impacts cognition, but I'm going to do my best anyway. A more important caveat is that I'm going to show you a smattering of papers from the academic economics research, just to give examples of mechanisms by which market forces can make equities larger or smaller, generally larger, not surprisingly. And I want to caveat that I am going to show you literally 0 community-engaged or community-based papers. And I'm also not going to show you papers that have done a deep dive into racial injustices in energy sectors. And that's not because I don't think those two are important. I think they're hugely important, which is why I've been so pleased with the composition of the panels over the last 2 days. But I'm going to show you these papers anyway, because I think that they have research value anyway, and I think they can complement the other approaches that we've been hearing about. At the same time, I want to recognize that this is like a gap in the academic research in the areas that I'm going to be talking about right now. Okay, so these 3 pictures are to give a sense that we are talking about 3 overlapping problems: environmental justice, energy justice, and climate justice. And the policies that address one of those might not address the other. So I want to be a little bit nuanced about the 3. I'll also make a plug while I'm on this slide for the podcast from which I stole the picture in the middle, the Just Energy podcast that looks at inclusive energy policy. If you aren't listening to it, I would recommend it. Okay, so the first of my 4 examples, what happens when we regulate pollution sources? This is one of the areas that has gotten the most attention in environmental economics. The graph on the left is showing you that over time, the amount of PM 2.5 measured at air quality monitors at ground level has decreased over the last 4 decades, and that it's decreased the most in places where levels used to be really high. So PM levels are falling, which is great, and the gap between the most polluted and the least polluted places is falling, also great. And on the right, you see a similar time series graph, but broken down by population-weighted non-Hispanic white communities and predominantly African-American communities. And again, PM 2.5 levels are falling, and it looks a little bit like maybe they're falling more in communities of color than in predominantly white communities, although the gap of that shrinking is not very large. So there are 3 different papers I've listed here that all get at related things. And what they generally point towards is that when we regulate air quality, it's not been with a goal towards reducing environmental injustices in the US, right? Until recently, that wasn't necessarily the #1 goal of environmental regulation. But it's been pretty successful at reducing things like PM 2.5 levels. It's also sort of maybe accidentally reduced the gap between PM 2.5 levels that are experienced predominantly in communities of color versus predominantly white communities. And again, this was not intentional. But the flip side of that is that we still see that levels are much higher in communities of color than in predominantly white communities. So the gap is closing, but it's still there, reflecting the fact that our energy systems are just built in this structure that, as everybody on this call already knows, disadvantages some people more than others. The second example that I'll give is from policies targeted not at environmental outcomes directly, but rather at the energy sector. And this is another example where rectifying injustices or alleviating inequities was not like baked into the plan, right? But it's worth looking after the fact at to what extent these policies increased or decreased inequalities in the US. So this is a paper from Burçin and Davis looking at who has filed for tax credits for different green energy technologies. And they look at a number of different technologies in the paper. And what the orange box is showing you is that the huge majority of these dollars have gone to very high income individuals. The plug-in electric drive vehicle credit is like the poster child for this, where something like 90% of the dollars have flowed to high income households. And Burçin and Davis go through potential mechanisms. Tax credits are non-refundable. So if you have a low income, you're not going to get anything back if you're not paying taxes. Expensive new technologies like these run up against credit constraints for low income families. Owners can take advantage of them and renters cannot. They probably make the most sense from a personally, financial standpoint if you use a lot of energy. And so you're really going to reap the benefits of a more efficient appliance or a more efficient vehicle going forward. So all of these things are pointing out the structural ways in which the energy sector disproportionately hits low income versus high income people, and how our policies that are not intended to address inequities can exacerbate those underlying inequities. Okay, third example, and now this is from my own research. I focus a lot on utilities, especially natural gas utilities, but these mechanisms are relevant to electricity utilities and also to water utilities and the kinds of water quality and aging water infrastructure problems that we see in lots of places, including my home state of Michigan. And the reason that I have focused a lot of my research on utilities is that, every single person in the US is hit by utility economics in some form or another, either their energy use or their water use or all of those. So there's something that are, impacting daily lives, and the economics of utilities are different from the economics of other large corporations in America. And so I think they're really worth studying on their own as we think about policy solutions, that we keep in mind how our policy solutions are going to interact with their market structure. So what's different about something like a natural gas or electric or water utility is that they have these really high fixed costs. Pipelines, wires, water treatment facilities, and they spread those really high fixed costs out across their entire customer base. That's just how we've always done business for utilities in the US. And what that means is that a lot of green programs that you might want to implement at the utility level or implement at the state or federal level, but that are going to impact how people interact with their utility, have the potential to raise prices for non-adopters. If that means that these new green programs primarily hit for high-income people who can afford the associated technology, it's going to be high-income people buying into these programs and raising prices for low-income people. One example from my research with Lucas Davis, suppose going forward, high-income households choose to electrify their homes, either because of improved indoor air quality, or because they want to contribute to a decarbonization effort, or because they manage to take advantage of government programs to subsidize decarbonization. So if high-income households install heat pumps and induction stoves and they disconnect from their local natural gas utility, that's going to mean that natural gas utilities, who are still trying to pay off pipelines and associated pipeline maintenance, are going to raise their prices for everybody else. And so this points again towards the way that market mechanisms can lead to perverse outcomes across income distributions if we're not really intentional going in. It also means that unless a low-income program targeting this literally gets every household, you could end up raising prices for any households that don't qualify. And that brings me to my last example, which is what are the things that we still don't know in energy economics? And I'd say one example of many is how to make energy access programs really work for low income and historically marginalized households. So wealth of research pointing towards the weaknesses and things like weatherization programs. And when they interact with that last example that I gave, it could mean that our decarbonization efforts really end up getting paid for by low income households if we don't think of better ways to structure these programs. And with that, I will cede the floor.
Thank you, Catie. Destenie?
Awesome. So thank you so much. And I'm actually going to be building on Catie's experience a little bit within her office, funny enough. So I'm going to be talking about addressing hidden forms of energy poverty, which is some work that my group and I have been leading. So building on Catie's.
Sorry, Destenie, is it okay to turn your camera on?
Oh, sorry,
Okay,
I didn't realize it went off. Thank you. So building on Catie's experience, I have a neighbor. She's an older woman in her 80s with cancer, and her windows are always open during the pandemic. And in her house, she actually ended up fainting during a summer heat wave and having to go to the hospital. So this is a person whose energy burden is very low. She's not disconnected from her electric utility, but she has a broken AC unit and often experiences mold within her house. And when we are looking at these community experiences, sometimes we see that even though energy burden dominates the poverty analysis, it actually misses some of these lived experiences. So just to ground this, in the Texas 2021 winter storm disaster, 246 people died. Now, there have been some reports estimating that this event's going to happen about every 10 years. In Arizona and Maricopa County, between 2006 to 2016, 228 heat-related deaths occurred indoors, right? And despite the presence of an AC unit. So we had about 30 households whose electricity was disconnected, 78 households willingly just turned off their air conditioning units, and 120 households had a broken AC unit. So even though the infrastructure was within their homes and many of these households were not disconnected, we see that they're still suffering within their homes because they feel like they either can't afford to replace their AC unit or they feel like they can't afford to use their AC unit. And then of course, there are those that got disconnected. So this actually indicates that we need to expand our metrics for energy poverty analysis. So we've talked a good amount about, people who are able to satisfy their demand, but at a high cost. That's the energy burden measure. And then we have those that are unable to satisfy any of their demands. So those are those that have gotten disconnected or those who experience outages. But there are a lot of people in the middle who are able to satisfy a part of their demand, but may be at risk. And this also can translate into different levels of risk. So this person who's in front of their fan, they may be at risk of like a heat illness, but we see this other person who now has gone beyond that risk of heat illness. And if they had not gotten to the hospital in time, they may have been at serious risk of a heat-related death. And this is one of the things that really has informed a lot of the research in my group. So what we've been doing is we have been working with a utility company and a stakeholder from the LIHEAP, so Low Income Housing Energy Assistance Program, to work to identify this gap that we're seeing. So here, if we have a graph of temperature on the X versus electricity usage in households, the green would represent a high income household, and this blue line would represent their cooling inflection temperature, which is the temperature at which they would start to turn on their air conditioning unit. So then what we did was working with the utility company in Arizona, we also got information about these low income households, which are represented by the black line in this illustration. And we found the gap between when they would actually start to turn on their air conditioning units. And we see that it's between 4 to 7 degrees Fahrenheit, just in when they would start using it. And that actually represents a huge energy equity gap currently in existence, because we see that low-income groups are just waiting a long time, and this is going to impact our planning. And then when we've looked across the years, so here on the x-axis, we have the different years of our analysis from 2015 to 2019, and then the inflection temperature, which again is the temperature at which different groups would turn on their air conditioning units, and the energy equity gap is at the top. So here in the first year, we have 6-degree difference, and the gray represents the lowest income group and the pink represents the highest income group. We see that it shifts down, but then over time, the gap is widening. And this actually is correlated with increasing electricity costs. And so one of the things that we need to ask ourselves is, as we are decarbonizing, how will this affect energy limiting behavior in low-income households? So we have the retirement of high-cost fossil fuel plants, but we also have the needed build out of transmission and renewable energy. And if we are seeing that, low-income groups significantly limit their energy consumption as the costs, increase, then this could mean that they would be putting themselves at greater risk during heat wave events, especially with climate change moving forward. So one of the things that we're currently doing is working with LAHEAP and utility companies to widen their definition of who should receive energy assistance and when they should be notified about different assistance options. And so for all the systems planners in the audience, some impacts of energy limiting behavior is that if we underestimate energy limiting behavior and the costs fall, then we significantly risk underbuilding the system, because we have a lot of people that want to use a lot more energy, but they're not doing it right now because they feel like they can't afford it. However, if we ignore energy limiting behavior and then climate with heat increases, then we could have greater health and energy poverty impacts on our hands. So this is something we really need to think about. Recognizing that we are in here with a lot of system planners, my group has also been working on how do we integrate these equity analyses into large-scale national level optimization models and planning. So this map just represents different power plants in the United States. And the big question is, how do national decarbonization policies impact the subnational distribution of air pollution from co-pollutants across the US? So we saw some analyses that have looked at quantifying those air pollution emissions. And now the question is, can we do a forward-looking analysis to estimate future air pollution impacts? So what we do is we take into account different decarbonization scenarios, and we feed that into our electricity system planning model at the national level. And this is then fed into an environmental sustainability analysis. We use a reduced complexity air pollution model to understand how the different air pollution emissions might settle across different demographic groups. And then we use that to conduct a local environmental sustainability analysis at the census tract level. So here is a graph of the total national operating PM emissions. So the black line, x-axis is the years, the y-axis is the PM emissions and total, and then the black line is the base case, the pink line is the low carbon case, and the blue line is the renewable energy 2035 case. And so what we see is these emissions are not going to necessarily be distributed equally. So here are 3 different maps representing where the reduced complexity model suggests that these emissions might settle. And so we see across the board, when we look at the 100% renewable mandates, it is falling from the base case. But in this scenario where we have a 2050 mandate, 54% of the census tracts are at the lowest level. And so then we have about 46% that are not. And the question is, how are these concentrations going to be spread across different race and ethnicity groups? So here, I'm just going to look at this 100% line because that represents population of race or ethnicity. So this 100% here with the red would be the Black population versus the white population. And then on the y-axis is the average annual PM concentration in micrograms per meter cubed. And between our base case and our 100% renewable energy 2050 mandate case, we see that the Black population has the highest concentration in both cases, but as we would expect, it does fall significantly. And so this would be a good tool for understanding some of those trade-offs we heard in the earlier session about multi-objective optimization and trying to understand the trade-offs. So some final thoughts in this quick 10-minute talk are that we need deployment of tech, but we also need a critical look at energy usage following that deployment. So we need to understand how people are using energy in their home, because energy limiting behavior in low-income groups is a hidden form of energy poverty. With our current focus on economic metrics of what % do you spend of your income on energy, we could be missing households that are not spending a large %, but also limiting and putting themselves at risk. I would like to thank my team at Carnegie Mellon, the Energy, Equity, and Sustainability Group, and these are some quick references. So thank you.
Thank you, Destenie, for the presentation. If I can ask all the panelists to turn on their videos for the Q&A, that would be great. So thank you to all of you for the presentations. We're already getting some questions. And again, please do not hesitate to put questions in the Q&A. I'm going to actually start with some of the harder high-level questions we've been grappling with over the last 2 days before going into some specific questions. So we've been talking a lot about capacity building over the past 2 days, capacity building in communities for advocating for energy justice and climate justice, but also capacity building in academia. What we've been hearing is, we're not so great at listening to communities and communities' needs. So how, do you have ideas on how, as academic researchers, we can do better to listen and hear and truly lift up to support communities who are on the front lines of, climate justice and energy justice related issues? And what can we do about, what can we do both in the research field where we're developing these tools, but also in our teaching? I know this is not an easy question.
Did you have one of us? Did you want us to each?
No, I want all of you to chime in.
Okay. All right. Well, I can start if that's all right. I mean, as I said, the research center where I'm housed at the New School University, we've adopted a set of principles that commit us to being in a position of co-production. And also that means setting a research agenda that's actually part of an invitation to be in collaboration with particular groups. So a lot of our research agenda is set by the demands and the relationships that we have with groups, environmental justice groups on the ground that are asking for technical assistance or help with a particular set of issues that they're contending with. And they tend to be really action oriented and advocacy oriented. And a lot of the research that traditionally has happened is not on the same timeline or it doesn't necessarily conform itself to advocacy goals, right? So it requires being in a different modality, I think, for research that's collaborative and open to being co-designed from the beginning. So as I mentioned, a lot of our research has come at the invitation. So we agenda set the design of the research together and the research questions and methodologies together. And that helps certainly to build trusted relationships with groups on the ground in terms of what they need and what they would like to, the kinds of research they'd like to see that could support their advocacy goals. So it's really participatory action research. And for one example is we did a research project with folks in Delaware. They really wanted to understand how their green energy funds were being spent in the state because they suspected, I think, as some of the research that's been presented by Destenie and Catie and others, that a lot of the SBC charges that they're paying on their utility wasn't coming back to their communities. And in fact, most of the funding that we found was actually going to commercial and institutional users. And most of them were in census tracts that had low to no populations of people of color. Or individual homeowners that were moderate and higher income homeowners. So, that kind of research we dug into with the folks on the ground in Delaware, looking at the census tracts and the counties that they were most interested in.
I'll weigh in. I don't think literally every research project needs to be community engaged. And in fact, I think it shouldn't be, because those projects take a lot of time and resources to really do them well. And sometimes you can't do that. And I think sometimes it's better to not try than to do it poorly, for reasons that I'm going to come back to in a minute. So I was trained as a community-based researcher in a past life, and I currently don't do very much of it. But what I try to do with every project is recognize my own position of power. And I think that is something you can do with every project, even if that doesn't lead to that project being a community engaged project. That as academics, as a white academic, as an economist, which has levels of authority with some government agencies that other even academics don't have, I have to recognize my own position of authority and make sure that I'm keeping that in mind with how I structure my research questions. So I think that is something you can always do. In my teaching, here's an example of what I might try to get my students to think about. We were talking about climate benefits, and they had read some readings about biodiversity and how you value biodiversity. And some of them were like, well, should we even be attaching dollar values to like the existence of a species? And so we got into the argument about that. It's a difficult thing to nail down. One student said, well, if we're policymakers, we have to come up with trade-offs, and this is one way to do it. So pragmatically, that's just what we need to do. And another student said, but who has a seat at the table when you're making those trade-offs? And I said, I think you're both right. So in what ways can we hold both of those in our hand at the same time? So just to close out, the reason why I say that not every project should be community engaged, although I think some of it really should be, is that when it's done poorly, it does end up being extractive, just by the nature of the existing power dynamics at play in academia and policymaking. The only way to make it not extractive is to really intentionally do that from the very beginning, and that requires a lot of resources. So what I'm hoping to do personally going forward is when I do that kind of research, I partner with people who are trained in it and who know how to do it a lot better than I do to make sure that we get it right from the beginning.
Yeah, so I'll build off of Catie's as well. Like I liked a figure yesterday that came up about different levels of community engagement for research. So, some research needs to be community informed. Some research should be working with like community stakeholders. Others need to be working directly with members of the community. And I think that that's really helpful because some, I guess, groups have mentioned like, the parachuting fatigue. And we heard about how detrimental that can be when academics parachute in and then just leave. And I think that these partnerships with representatives that know really well what's happening in the community, that are really engaged with talking to the community, I think that's super important. And I really do hope that those research dollars do incentivize that. I mean, as someone who's an assistant professor on the tenure track, like it is very difficult to try to find a funding source that bridges both of these. But I do think that like there needs to be this, I guess, reframing of thinking in academia that you don't always have to be the expert in every single thing. And like to really be transdisciplinary, collaborative, you need to make sure that you're getting like leaders who do different things well. Now on the teaching side, for the, like one of the things that I have experienced recently is the like colorblind culture of well-being. And I think that, it's coming from often like a good place, but it actually can be pretty harmful for education, because by trying to be colorblind and saying we're going to treat everyone the same, that then leads to this lack of acknowledgement of different groups have different lived experiences. And so we're not training the students to do that. So one thing that I recently did this year in my class was I told them that they were going to, come up with plans for mitigating the next Texas type disaster, the winter storm disaster. And I separated them into random groups where I did it by perceived race and gender. And then I did a reverse racism where people who historically don't get benefits got all the benefits and privileges, and people who historically get all the benefits received no benefits and privileges. And their ideas were quickly thrown out. Now, some professors are like, oh, you're so brave to do that. And I'm like, well, that's actually how the world really works, right? Like, people have privilege, other people don't. And that's why we have the need for procedural justice, right? But I think that there needs to be, I guess, some like instructor bravery to have those hard conversations, because it is really difficult. And something that I really enjoyed that happened after the class and the reflection was one of my white male students told me he felt like nothing in his education had ever been unfair until my class, right? And I think that's one reason why we have such a hard time like getting engineers to think about how to do these like social justice things in their work, because many of them have never felt like anything was unfair.
Thanks, Destenie. That's an awesome example.
Sure, I'll finish up. It's not going to top some of what's gone before me. So I agree with a lot of what's been said, and thanks for that example. It's really interesting to think about doing that. I was just going to bring up two things that haven't been brought up yet that I think are integral in academia and kind of flipping this problem a bit. One is our like major pipeline problem of who is showing up as students and then who is even later getting into faculty positions. And so the things that we can do to expand who's here is going to help with some of these issues. And then two, there's like a really bad incentive structure, which has sort of been brought up already around historically community engaged research didn't really count as any part of, for example, being promoted and getting tenure. And there wasn't this recognition of the time it takes to build relationships and the amount of money it might take to do this type of research. And I think that's shifting, but I think even more so it needs to be like formalized into guidelines that are used by people higher up. Because especially, I think a lot of us here are assistant professors. And so, yeah, until you kind of achieve this next level, it's hard. You don't have as much freedom as you might want. So those are just like two kind of pinch points that I think also would be helpful to work on.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, John. Definitely, incentives in academia are not the best suited for the kind of questions that we're grappling with. Okay, I'm going to ask another high-level question, and then I'm going to go to some of the specific questions in the Q&A. So over the past, session and this session, we've seen a lot of research and then a lot of overlapping research topics from different disciplines. Economics and engineering is probably, closer, but there's environmental sciences and, public policy and all sorts of different disciplines working on similar issues coming from different angles. But we haven't been seeing a lot of, good interdisciplinary, connections until, very lately. So how can we build more interdisciplinary connections and build more interdisciplinary research? And, how can we build a platform that will enable this? Because there are a lot of synergies, we've seen from today's discussion and your discussion. So what are your thoughts on building that kind of movement forward?
I can go first on this one. Events like this, there's already multiple people that I've thought, I should email after doing something like this. So any way to kind of keep this communication between interested parties going, because it's hard to get the breadth of the research. We all probably have our own little Google Scholar alert set up and are reading different news sources. And so, yeah, the more we can learn about the interplay of what people are doing, is the best that's the best idea I have for now.
I'll just mention, I just posted that, we have a postdoc research position. We'll probably have another one coming out soon and a research director position. We really need, I think, to build a pipeline for like emerging scholar activists, interdisciplinary scholars, to find places. It's really hard for them to find a home in traditional departments when they're doing work that cuts across different sectors and fields. Again, it's like the incentive structure of traditional academia. So the more we can create spaces for those academics to flourish and to really find a place to do innovative work that cuts across different sectors, gives them colleagues and peers that they can pull from and be mentored by. I think that's really important as well. And investing in, particularly in BIPOC emerging scholars that are in this sector, I think is crucial. I think the complexity of the problems we're dealing with today will require us all to be interdisciplinary. So we need to start, sharpening our tools and getting our pipelines ready. So if anyone has any great potential postdocs, please let us know. We'd love to encourage that next pipeline.
So for me, I sometimes tell people that poor people are a lot smarter than we think they are. Because when I give my energy limiting behavior talk, sometimes, it's surprising how many people suggest to me that instead of doing this work, I educate people on how to wear blankets in the winter, right? So to me, I'm like, wow, okay, I could do that, but you may not realize that I was one of those people that got disconnected, right? And like my research builds off of my lived experience, right? And then people are often really shocked, but it's like, yes, I have been disconnected and I was limiting my energy consumption. And we used to turn off our heat when we would go into the grad school office until our landlord told us we were at risk of letting our pipes freeze and we were going to end up spending a lot more money, right? And so I think that there really does need to be this shift away from the, ivory tower being more knowledgeable than the lived experience. And I think a part of that is one, kind of working with engineering students to not just do that, we're going to come in and have all the problems, but actually training them on how to listen, right? So we're really good at telling people what to do, but how do we train them to be the one that talks last in the meeting, right? To listen to all the problems and then try to come up with a solution with the community and ask, do you think that this will work, right? Too many times we miss that question. Do you think that this will actually work? Or do you think that this is going to meet your needs? And, from my experience, my first ever research experience was not in engineering. It was actually in education. And I was tasked with trying to help girls in Malawi stay in school. And we found out that they were dropping out because of their periods. And, we had to, I researched what people used to do before we kind of have this throwaway culture. And it's okay, well, how about reusable pads? Will that work? And we had to really work with the community to see would you be willing to wash these things and hang them up? Is it taboo it's taboo here in the US? And that type of thing. And I think with energy, it's the same thing, right? Nobody wants to admit that they're poor or suffering in their house, but on Zoom, we see a lot of people, different people in blankets and coats on Zoom, right? And different levels of that. And then we also need to get away from this, kind of theory of the rebound effect always being a bad thing, right? Because there are a lot of people who aren't using as much as they really should. And understanding okay, what are you actually using the energy for? What do you want to use it for? And what's your actual goal, right? I think a lot of times we focus on energy efficiency, let's reduce consumption, let's kind of get it lower, lower. But then there are some people who are already at their minimum. They don't want to hear about that. They want to hear about how they can use more to better their lives, right? And I think getting everybody to this, wherever they want to be, right, is and should be the goal. And then working with people in the field to do that, I think is really important. So I will be the first to admit that I have not gone and talked to many low-income households, but by working with LawHeap, right, by working with the Weatherization Assistance Program and kind of trying to understand what are some of the barriers to getting help to these people, and how can we help them, like, advocate for more money or advocate for widening their inclusion of these different types of households, I think is really important.
Thank you, Destiny. Any other thoughts? Okay, Catie, there was a question for you in the Q&A about utilities. Obviously, there are lots of bad incentives in the utility space. So from your perspective, what are research and action pathways to address these structural challenges in decarbonization and especially providing benefits to marginalized communities?
Yeah, I saw that question. I was just starting to type it. So great, now I can answer it live. The question referred briefly to net metering. I do think that there is an equity problem with net metering, although it's also easy to leverage that to stop progress, right? So those things might both be true. I think that points towards why some of this research is, this like quantified research is, this quant-focused research is important because it helps you understand the magnitude of the problem. Is it like qualitatively important, or is it small enough that we can ignore? But I think the answer to your question is ultimately going to be context specific, whether we're talking about electrification or energy efficiency or water quality problems and like aging, depopulating cities. I think the answer is going to be different for different sectors, depending on which kind of utility we're talking about, the ownership structure of it, and what kinds of population it serves. So I'll put up a link to our paper, which gives examples for the electrification context. And we go through, 7 different policy options, ultimately concluding that none is a silver bullet, and we might need some combination of the different policy options. One possibility is moving some of these decarbonization costs out of the utility cost structure and into the federal tax base. That might be a way to make it less regressive. Although by itself, that poses many other challenges, obviously. So again, I don't think there's one single solution, but I'll put up a link.
Okay, great, thank you, Catie. Destiny, there are 2 questions for you. One is, do you take into account the low-income families who cannot even afford to turn on their air conditioning, or who do not turn it on because of subpar infrastructure? And then there's a general question about, how can programs such as LIHEAP address the electrical and structural rehabilitations necessary for clean energy transformations?
So in our study, we took all that data from the utility company, because the utility was saying that they had under utilization of their own energy poverty alleviation programs. And so they wanted to talk with us about how to identify multiple forms of poverty. And so all households were included. We do see that there are some with lack of infrastructure. So for example, when we see the curve kind of ticking up and then all of a sudden there's a break, then we actually say this is probably when they either experienced a broken AC unit for a certain amount of time, and that would actually be the prime time for a utility company to send out one of those, did you know that you can buy an efficient AC unit flyer, right? We also see that when we hold the household size constant and the number of AC units constant, the low income groups actually just have a lot flatter of a curve. So when holding infrastructure constant, we see much flatter curves, meaning they're not using as much, most likely due to financial strain. And then we've also been able to look at the different usage points for when they would start using it by infrastructure. Now, I should say that I can't tell if a person's using a window unit versus a fan. I don't have that level of data. I just have household level energy consumption, but we have all the households that the utility gave us. And so then, sorry, the second question was about the infrastructure that LIHEAP would need, right? Yes,
about the transformations that, sorry, let me find the answer. The question about what we would need to do with LIHEAP to make sure we can have the clean energy transformation.
Yeah, so I will not claim to be a LAHEAP expert. That's why I have a collaborator who's a director at LAHEAP. So I would advocate that if whoever that is, if you email me, I will include her in our conversation. But one of the things that she and I have been advocating for, and we're going to a conference together to advocate for, is a need to not be so siloed when we're trying to address poverty, right? So trying to address energy poverty without trying to address housing poverty is a big problem. And then one of the things that now she's asked me to look into is to quantify the benefit of technology adoption, right? So a lot of times we have, these targets where we're going to deploy X amount of solar panels by X date to X amount of low-income households. And so one of the things that we're trying to look at now, and we're hoping to get some funding to do, is to actually say, okay, once a household adopts a heat pump or a solar panel, how does that change the way that they're using their energy? Is it just that they're using more? Is it that they can start cooling earlier? Is it that they start heating earlier? And then trying to understand how this technology adoption impacts the kind of lived experience and energy usage within the home. And so I think that that's like a big important thing moving forward, to not just look at the capacity of these technologies and how much we're deploying, but how people are using them and how they're interacting with them. So it's definitely a lot of work that needs to be done. Another thing that she and I have also been trying to advocate for is to not just do energy burden based on gross income, but on your disposable income, because we know that there are some households who spend 80 or 90% of their income on rent alone. So having energy burden at a 10% threshold is just unrealistic for some households. And those are going to be ones that are severely limiting, and they just can't afford anymore. And so there might be some households that we're missing in our identification.
Great, thank you, Destiny. So we're at time, but I want to ask this one lightning round question really quick. If right now somebody came and gave you here $1 million, spend it all on research, what are your priority research questions or data gaps?
Gee, $1 million would be great, but if it was focused on energy, I would probably focus on community energy planning, because I think some of what Catie and Destiny describe are, needing to understand like what are the needs in the population, and getting a real sense of the complexity of like the energy, the type of energy burn, the type of energy need, and the types of resource delivery that's going to actually really impact households. So we promoted actually community energy planning as an approach. The Center for Earth, Energy, and Democracy actually started this recommendation out in Minnesota, and we've actually adopted it in the state of New Jersey and New York, several other states. And it's a great way to get more granular data and understanding and resources to the ground. So I would do a lot more energy planning from a community perspective.
I'll take several $1 million, and I will try to understand how decarbonization is going to affect health and how we should target this, mostly at the end stages, but also thinking about, there was a question somewhere about mineral extraction and if we're just shifting the burden of exposure to different populations. And so more money to think about how to do that better would be great.
I was afraid of this question because I don't have anything right now, because I very intentionally cleared my desk at the end of the semester, because the summer is the time when you get to think deep thoughts and figure out the next steps. So my summer plan is to figure out the answer to that question, and anybody who has ideas should email me.
And so for me, if I had money, then I would be, I think, looking for more hidden forms of poverty. So I think a part of it would be to talk to multiple community groups in different parts of the country. So, our partner in Arizona really highlighted this heat-related death challenge, but I know that there are other parts of the country where maybe having information on oil usage, natural gas usage, right? How much do people want to consume versus how much are they able to? And then I would love to be able to identify like, when do different households become unsafe? Because that's a huge question, right? So much of, we know that indoor environment is really important for productivity, but given that there's a vastly different housing stock, right? And, there's some really old houses, some really new ones, like when does it become unsafe? And, how can we address that moving forward?
Okay. Great. On that great note, I want to thank you all for this great conversation. I certainly look forward to reading more of your research and collaborating and continuing this conversation moving forward. So we are running behind schedule, but